what we really just want to accomplish is you've been around and in the mainstream for a while, and your recollections, what happened, what you think the causes are, what have we learned since, what have we done right since, what have we done wrong, what's your vision for the future, what do you think the challenge is, how do we engage the next generation, all that kind of stuff.
Right,
You know,
absolutely.
so
A mouthful.
that's my question. So you're on.
Great. Well, you know, it's Bob. It's hard to imagine that we're coming up on the 50th year anniversary of 1967. Doesn't seem like it was that long ago. I was a junior in School of Engineering, University of Michigan at the time, and back home in Detroit, working in a summer job when that all started in late July of '67. It's not a good time in our history. It was a terrible thing that happened to Detroit. It's taken us a long time to recover. But having said that, it's a part of our history, and it's important to understand what that was about and why we did it and how we've come to where we are now. And a lot of things certainly have happened. I think we were talking earlier about just what you call that in 1967. I try not to call it a riot. I don't think it was that. I think it was an insurrection and a disturbance. 1943 in Detroit was another unfortunate time, and I think that was a riot. It started between races, African American and white, on Belle Isle. It spread from there. A lot of property damage. It was not a good time, and that was a riot. When you look at 1967, it was more of a disturbance. It was more of the population, the citizens of Detroit expressing their displeasure with their quality of life, with the inequality in employment, income, housing options, services available, school system declining, and just a general frustration. And so, quite frankly, the spark was something like the raid on a blind pig on 12th and Claremont late one night, which really had nothing to do with all of those things, but it was something that ignited then the frustrations of the citizens. So it was different in '67, obviously much more damaging to the community. At the time that happened, we in Detroit were bragging, as you know, that was a national trend back then with Watts and Philadelphia and Newark and Atlanta and other cities that were having riots. And we were bragging with the fact that we weren't having one in Detroit. And sure enough, we did have it, and ours was the biggest and the worst in terms of property damage and the like. And so it happened to us here in Detroit, and we've had to recover from that. And it's been a long road. I'm hoping that when we actually get to 2017, that we'll be able to look back on that and really see all of the significant progress that's been made and the great things that are happening in Detroit. As you know, we're in a rebirth and revitalization now that is unheard of for Detroit. Everybody wants to come to Detroit now. Everybody wants to invest. There's a sense of positiveness now in Detroit, and we're moving in the right direction. So I think this is great. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thanks. Thank you. It is, and that's exactly what we want to do, is use kind of the advent of 2017 to say, we understand where we've been, we've learned, but rather than destruction, how do we continue the rebuilding in the positive momentum of what's going on in the city? Not for everyone, but increasingly it's bringing more people along, and how can we go forward to make sure that that continues, and most importantly, control the narrative so someone else doesn't decide to tell the story a different way, or perhaps emphasize those parts of the story that we're ready to learn from and move from.
Right. And I think we have, you know, that was in 1967, as I mentioned. I mean, there was a huge disconnect between the general population of Detroit, which at that time was approaching 50-50 African American and white, and the people who were in fact running the city administration, the police department, the fire department, available jobs. There just wasn't a real connection. The police department had what was known then as the Big Four, which was just an unbelievable tactic that they used, but it was they used the huge Chryslers. I remember when I was a kid, I mean, they'd have these four-door Chryslers, and it would be two uniformed officers, 2 detectives, and they always seemed to be of large in size. Now maybe that was because I was just a young kid at the time, but they were very menacing, and they literally patrolled through the communities, particularly the black communities, and quite frankly reigned a lot of terror in the community. We also had this thing called STRESS that the police commissioner put in place then, and that was an acronym for Save Detroit Streets, Enjoy Safe Streets. Stop the robberies, enjoy safe streets. And it turned into just an assassination squad. I mean, they had like 14 killings because of that. 13 were African Americans. And so you had those kinds of things going on in the community, and nobody's voice was being heard. And so that insurrection started because of that and that disconnection and no relationship. And so it, quite frankly, propelled the election of Coleman A. Young in 1973 as the first African-American mayor who campaigned literally on, if I'm elected, I will eliminate stress. First thing I'm going to do. That was his basic program. And he was a very articulate state senator at the time, very politically connected, and was able to propel himself into office and began to do that. And so he began to reconnect the community with the city administration. One of the things he did and said is that because the city's population is 50-50, I'm going to make all of my appointees and the department heads be 50-50. And so every time he would appoint a white as a director, he would have a black deputy director. Or if he had a black director, he would appoint a white deputy director. And that made a huge difference. I mean, we saw department leadership reflecting the community in a way that had never been done before. The fire department and the police department. Matter of fact, we had to go to federal court in both of those instances to try to integrate the fire department, to try to integrate the police department, to get more African Americans and people of color into the police academy and the fire academy. And he was successful in many cases, not so successful in others, but it was the beginning of creating a connection with the community and the folks that were providing them services who were sworn to preserve and protect. And so we see now that connection, now we just take it for granted. But it makes a huge difference now in terms of what happens and the discontent that people have, and they feel like they have a voice and a connection. And so, I was happy to be a part of that back in the late 70s and early 80s, and I see it continuing now, and now I serve for Mayor Duggan, who's the first white mayor in 40 years. And so we've seen a lot of things happen in between, and he's continuing that process through our department of neighborhoods and other ways. He saw the value then, and I think he sees it now, of having the connection between the city and the neighborhoods.
What was your neighborhood like, or your parents' neighborhood like, back then, and was there a change after '67?
Well, there was, but it had already happened in our neighborhood. We came to Detroit in 1957 from Cincinnati, Ohio. My dad was part of the UAW and came to work for Walter Reuther, who was the president of UAW at the time. And so we moved into an area called Russell Woods, which is in the Dexter-Davison area. A nice middle-class neighborhood at the time, predominantly Jewish. I think we were the second African-American family to move on the block on Sturtevant and Dexter there when we moved in 1957. But by the time we got to 1960, it was an African-American neighborhood. And so it changed very quickly. And so the Jewish community kind of moved from there to further northwest Detroit in the 7 Mile, Wyoming, Schaefer area, and then of course beyond and moving into Oak Park. So by the time we got to 1967, it was a predominantly African-American community. But again, you still had all of the disparities that were going on, and the city was starting its mass exodus of folks leaving Detroit, which started, of course, in the 50s. Everybody likes to blame that on Coleman Young and the so-called insurrection in 1967, but the population decline in Detroit started, quite frankly, in the 50s in the mid-50s with the advent of shopping malls, Northland Mall, and other things that just started moving people out. That's not to say that the insurrections and the other things that were happening, decline in the schools, decline in city services, didn't contribute to that exit, but it started long before we had those riots. Those things were exacerbated by the decline. And so you went from a city that maybe was 15, 20% African American to 50% to 55 to 60%. And the record will show that that begins to start the isolation of a community from those that are in power. And that's when the problems start. And so we were impacted by the riots in Russell Woods, right down Dexter Avenue. I mean, we had the fires. We had tanks in the National Guard literally running down Dexter Avenue. It was a major impact. The curfew was in place, so my friends and I, we couldn't be out after dark. It was some pretty harrowing times in Detroit, and so I think we were all affected, whether you were lower class, middle class, upper middle class. Everybody in Detroit was literally affected by that.
How about, one of the things that often comes up is black business ownership. And do you relate any changes in that dynamic to 67 or what I've often heard is that before 67, 12th and Claremont and various areas had black-owned or Jewish-owned businesses, and after 67, that seemed to have changed.
It did, but again, I'm not so sure 67 was the catalyst of it. But you're right, there were a lot of black-owned businesses. I mean, if you look at the grocery stores, the dry cleaners, beauty supply stores, those were all African-American owned in 60s and 70s. They were spread out from what started in Paradise Valley, and as African-Americans began to move out of Paradise Valley and the Lower East Side into other areas of the city, those businesses followed them. But then as the 70s came into play, and it may have had something to do with the insurrection, the dry cleaning business turned to basically the Koreans. The supermarkets were taken over by the Asian community and the Arab community, and so we began to lose a lot of the small African-American ownership businesses, and so all we had were barbershops and beauty salons, quite frankly. And so it changed the format of black ownership in the community. And then, too, that starts to lead in a disconnect again, because you've now got different ethnic groups having themselves in the middle of another ethnic group providing those services. And so you don't have the same connection that is there. And so you get this slow disconnect that eventually, if it's not handled positively, comes out to be not so good a situation. And we saw that in Detroit. But probably a lot of reasons that led to that. And again, I don't want to give all the credit to just the insurrection, but a lot of it was population migration and the changing of the demographics in each of those communities.
Well, that's very true, and you've said it a couple times about correctly have said it wasn't just 67, and that's the point of what we're trying to tell in this whole story. So we're going to look back, probably just for convenience, look back 100 years to 1917, and look forward to 2067. So what in that 150-year period, what did we see happen, and what do we see happening going forward? And it's kind of an interesting way to do it, but I think it's a way to use history in an instructive, proactive, productive way.
Oh, no question about it.
Dwell.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's your thoughts about the last 50 years? What have we done right? What have we done wrong? What are some of the things that we should continue? What should we do differently?
Well, I think what we've done right is to and started, I think, with Mary Coleman Young, is to increase the relationship and the connection between those in power and those that aren't in power, in terms of connection, in terms of listening to folks and providing a voice and an avenue for people to express their concerns. I think we've done a pretty good job of that as a city and as various administrations overall making that happen. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, you can see now in just about every city department, I mean, there are African Americans, there are Hispanics, in positions of power in every one of these departments. And so people feel a lot more connected with what's going on. You culminate that now with a mayor like Mike Duggan, who has gone the extra mile with respect to that, who not only has put in place this Department of Neighborhoods, which he's asked me to run and implement, which has district managers in each of the council districts, but he himself literally goes out into the neighborhoods and talks to the people, more so than I've seen any other mayor. And I've, served for 6 mayors, including Coleman Young. And this is not a knock on the other mayors. It's just a question of management style. But he literally believes in walking the streets and driving the streets of Detroit and talking to the neighbors. And so when we did the campaign 2 years ago, we had this thing called house parties, where we would go literally to people's living rooms, their backyards, their basements, sometimes a barbershop on the main drag. And he would sit down with 10, 15, 20 people at a time and just talk with them about what their concerns were and what they wanted to see out of their administration. Obviously, we were successful in the campaign, but he didn't stop doing that. And so he has us still schedule 4 to 5 of those, we call them now house meetings, where he goes into the neighborhood and literally sits down in the living room and talks to the block club captains, people that live next door, and says, what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong? And let's have some dialogue, and stays an hour, sometimes for 2 hours. Very interesting, Bob, about 2 weeks ago, he was having a conversation with the governor, Governor Snyder. And he was telling him, you Governor, you should get a little more comfortable with Detroiters, and you should stop talking at Detroiters and start talking with them. The governor says, well, what do you mean? He says, well, I do these house meetings. Why don't you come with me to one of those meetings? The governor was like, what? So we put a meeting together on the west side over on Chalfont, Wyoming. And we just picked them like that for the mayor. And went into the block captain and put the meeting together. Now, we didn't tell them the governor was coming and the mayor was coming, and so they set up. And so it was 20, 25 people. It was a decent day a couple of weeks ago, so the homeowner said, well, I can't put everybody in the living room. I'll put a little tent up outside. So he did that. So we're sitting outside, and the mayor's there. And he explained to them, I've got a guest coming, and a surprise guest. And they said, well, what do you mean? You're our surprise guest. We don't get mayors coming here every day. And lo and behold, up pulls the governor, and he gets out, and he sits down there with the governor. And so for an hour and a half, we're sitting there just having a good general conversation with some citizens on Chalfont and Wyoming. But being a part of the community, the governor loved it. I mean, his staff literally had to pull him out of there. He had other places to go, and he wanted to stay, and they had to leave, and so he left in an hour, and the mayor was there for another half an hour after that. But what it does is it keeps the leadership really connected with the people. I mean, as the mayor says, if I want to hear, just a lot of good stories about Detroit and what's happening in neighborhoods, I'll ask my staff. Yeah. But if I really want to know what's going on out there, I can go out in the community and ask myself. He's done that. That's a hallmark of his administration. It was a part of his campaign, and it's paid off. Kwame Kilpatrick was good at doing that. When I worked for him, he went into the community a lot. You've got Dennis Archer coming later. He did that, not as much, but he was doing a part of that too. And so I think what happened was our leadership in Detroit learned that we fare better as a community when the leaders are more connected with just the common citizens in Detroit and are listening to them, hearing what their concerns are, and then responding to that. And doing something about it. And that was what was missing in 1967. And quite frankly, Jerome Kavanaugh, who was the mayor at the time of the 67 rebellion, it was part of the reason that he lost that next campaign to Roman Gribbs, because people just felt he was disconnected with the community and wasn't really hearing their problems and their issues and concerns. And so I think if we've learned anything in that 50-year period, it's been that. And so now it's forming the basis of literally the revitalization of Detroit. And so you've got a Mayor Duggan, you've got Mike Ilitch, you've got Dan downtown, and the things that are going on in downtown and midtown, Sue Mosley here in midtown, who are all connected with their community and the things that they're doing, and they're listening. as we begin to revitalize it. I think that's the biggest piece that we've learned out of this.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think we've seen a marked improvement in the region perception of Detroit. And when we look at the story of '67 and really the last 100 years, obviously you need to look at the region because one could argue Detroit went down and Southfield came up, or whatever analogy you might want to use. Any thoughts about how we might better going forward engage the region for the common good of where this region's going?
Yeah, and that's always a challenge, Bob. And everybody always looks at in the state as Detroit, and it's down there,
Right.
and those people. When in fact Detroit is obviously it's the major part of the city. It's the largest city in Detroit, and quite frankly, when people really think about it, we had, if you go back to '67, where we had maybe 1.4, 1.5 million people, now we're at about 670,000. So that's about 800,000 people that left in that period of time. Those are all Detroiters and ex-Detroiters that now live in the outlying suburbs, and so they're still a part of Detroit. You talk to most people that live out in the suburbs, and they still have a spiritual connection with Detroit. They still ride on Sunday afternoons with their kids and go through the old neighborhood and see if the old house still exists and talk to their kids about, I went to that school, your grandmother lived in that house, I met your mother there in that school, we used to go here and hang out all the time. So there's the connection's already there. We just have to, through our leadership, make people feel and understand that connection is still there, and it's very important. Dan Gilbert recognizes it. Pete Carmanos recognized it. Mike Ilitch recognized it. I mean, they're doing these things because they still feel that connection with Detroit. Mike Duggan feels it. He talks about growing up on 6 Mile and Schaefer. And so he tells people when he's out there, I lived on Stansbury and went to the school. I went to school over here. So the connection is still there. We just need leadership to remind people of that. And when you do it, people start to feel good about it. And because we're now moving far enough away from that insurrection in 1967, and there's a very positive feeling about Detroit, it's easier to do it. And so now you talk about Detroit, and Cranes talks about homecoming. You get a lot more people showing up for the homecoming because they want to come back, because it's positive. We had way too many years where there was just a negative connotation, and people, I don't think I really want to come back. And I don't like what I see when I go back to my own neighborhood. But even it's the same old neighborhood, unfortunately still sometimes in bad shape, but they feel more positive about Detroit and where it's heading. And so they're starting to come back. And that's what drove Dan Gilbert and Mike Ilitch and Pete Carmanos and these guys to say, I'm going to help fix it up. I'm going to put more money back in Detroit and really fix it up so that we can get back to where we were. And I always say, we'll never see the Detroit that we used to see. I look at all the pictures around here in the Historical Museum, and a lot of nostalgia here. But we're never going to see exactly that again. But we can get that feeling back of what we had when we were a part of that and a part of making those pictures. And that's the key, and that's the challenge that our leaders are going to have, is to give people that feeling that Detroit can be and will be a great city to live in again. And that's, good city services, a connection, an involvement, money, investment. And so I think we're on our way back to that. But it's all about the feeling of Detroit and then that connection.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. It's not going to be the same, but the feeling can be the same. And that's just a you see it at the airport when people used to say, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Bloomfield Hills, or I'm from Troy. Now people say, I'm from Detroit.
From Detroit, and it makes a difference. I mean, as I said, I grew up near Dexter and Davis, and I mean, I shopped at the stores there. There were, unbelievable men's stores. There was a great grocery store there. It was called the Dexter Davison Market. Even when it moved to Oak Park, they still called it the Dexter Davison Market. That's never going to look physically the same as it used to when I grew up there, but we can have a 12-year-old start to walk up Dexter and feel the same way I did when I was 12 years old, walking up there, maybe going to a different kind of a store, or maybe it's a smaller Myers or a different kind of a grocery store. Going to buy a loaf of bread like I did for my mom. It's going to look different, but you can still feel the same, and that's our challenge.
Right, right. No, I think that's right. You know, I run into people, oh, I want to do a documentary about Detroit's comeback, and my reaction is, get in line, you know,
That's
or
right.
better get on it.
That's
You know,
right.
that category's about full.
Yep.
You know, there's
Yep.
there's so much interest, which is, of course, fantastic. But, you know, one of the things that this project has caused us to think about, is, especially as we look forward, is, as much as we don't want to admit it, you and I aren't always going to be here. And it's that next generation of leadership. And based on your experience and your assessment of the last, not 100 years, but 50 years, I guess, what do you see going forward, or what do you think the lessons are, or the advice you would give to that next generation of leaders? And how do we identify those leaders? That's often a comment that, who are they?
Yeah, we talk about that a lot, you know, and quite frankly, it's the millennials. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the term they use now.
I know you're surrounded by them.
Yeah, we got a lot of them, some really good, sharp ones
Yeah.
in the administration. You know, these kids left east side of Detroit, west side of Detroit. They went to Harvard and Yale, and
Yeah.
they came back, and they're just absolutely brilliant. But they look and think and act differently about things the same way that we did. I mean, social media now plays such a role in how people communicate. And so again, the challenge is our leaders are going to have to figure out how to get that feeling that I talked about, that people need to have about where they live and where they recreate and where they decide to marry and build a family. How do you get that feeling in kids who are on their cell phone and on their iPad all of the time?
Yeah.
The communication is different. It's well beyond television, as you know. So it's going to take a different way of communicating now. To the extent that they become the ones in power, they'll figure out a way to do it, and we've got a lot of that going on now. Most of my staff, who are young folks, they joke with me all the time, and they have to help me along. I'm usually the last one on the team
Yeah.
to get connected with the new iPad or the new computer or whatever it is that we're going to get. But I think that's going to be the key, is figuring out how to put into the millennials' language why they should feel the way they do about home. And quite frankly, it's still inside of them. I mean,
Yeah.
like I say, because they were in the car when the parents drove them around and said, you know, I grew up over
Yeah.
there, and that's the school I went to. And so they begin to feel that connection. And they'll just manifest that differently. But I think it's going to come back. You look at the things that Dan Gilbert and what he's doing with those multitude of companies down there. Many of those are high-tech companies that are, in fact, on the cutting edge of communications and the things that are going on down there. And that's what's driving the young folks, the millennials and the young professionals downtown and in this area. And so it's coming. It's just going to, again, it'll look a little different and it'll function a little different, but I think it's going to make people feel the same way in that same connection.
Yeah, that's technology that's kind of the big unknown.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's okay from the millennials' perspective if they check out other things first and then come back. That's
Right.
okay too.
That's right.
Because I think they can bring back some good ideas.
Oh, there's no
It's
question.
not going to be the same.
Yeah.
You know, our daughter's graduating from U of M this spring,
Mm-hmm.
and Detroit is the number 3 place everyone wants to go.
Right.
You know, New
Right.
York and Chicago.
No, that's
That's
right.
great.
Yeah, there's no
She's
question.
coming here, so we're excited about that.
Yeah, I mean, we, for a long time, I mean, our kids went away to school, went away to college, and they quite frankly never came back
Right.
to live. They'd come back to visit, but never came back. And now we're starting to see more of them coming back. But there's more jobs, there's more excitement, there's more entertainment, there's more of the things that attracts them here in Detroit. And we've had leadership that's been wise enough to make sure that's a part of what we do. We couldn't just be you know, the Motor City. We couldn't
Right.
just be a manufacturing town. That's an important part and a fabric of our community, which I think will always be there, quite frankly, because we still have some of the greatest manufacturing complexes in the world right here. But we had to expand and do some more things, and this social media stuff is allowing us to do that. And so now we got Google and all of those companies,
great.
Galaxy Solutions and others that are right downtown that are doing state-of-the-art things that are happening. We used to, you know, only happen out in the valley out in California. And so this is very exciting times for Detroit, no question.
you know, as you know, you and I both go to plenty of social events and parties. Now they're all here. None of them are out there.
That's right.
Which is amazing, which is great.
That's exactly right.
Geographically undesirable, you know, to go out there. It's
Right.
just not doing it.
Yeah,
Just not doing it.
told somebody the other day, I can't remember the last time I went out to the Palace. There's no knock on them, but I just,
I'm with you.
you know,
I
there's
can't
too much
imagine.
happening downtown. I
Yeah.
don't need to go out there.
Yeah,
So.
no, I would agree. I would agree. Oh, any thoughts about, you know, the neighborhoods? Obviously, you think a lot about the neighborhoods, and I know those are big challenge, and they're all different, and there's different challenges. And is there anything you can think of that collectively the community, or you know, maybe connected or not connected to what we're trying to do, can do to help move the neighborhoods forward?
Well, you know, obviously it's a lot, and we certainly have a neighborhoods focus
Yeah.
in this administration. You know, again, when we were on the campaign trail 2 years ago, I mean, the biggest issue that people talked about, even more so than the crime, which was still high on the list, was the blight in the neighborhoods. And obviously that's when you think about it, it's a natural offshoot. I mean, if you lose 6, 7, 800,000 people in the population, you're going to leave a lot of vacant homes and abandoned homes. You get an abandoned home in Detroit, and if you leave it for more than 2 weeks, what happens? Somebody comes and starts to strip it, and they take the windows out, and they take the bricks off, and it becomes a blighted piece of property. You couple that with the decline in, because when families leave, they take kids with them, and so you now have a decline in the population of the schools, and so that went from a huge population of kids in the school when I was there in the 60s to some 300,000, to now we're down to 47,000 kids in Detroit public schools. So you leave a lot of vacant school buildings. Well, every neighborhood has at least one school. So now you've got those that are abandoned and vacant. And so blight becomes a major thing that not only drives the decrease in property values, but it just takes people's mental state and feeling about their community. If you live across the street from an abandoned house or next door where you're afraid that it may catch on fire and, you know, affect your house, it's clearly going to affect your property values. It changes your whole state of mind about that. So it became more of a driving force of complaint than crime did. They would tell the mayor, if you can get these houses torn down, maybe we think we got a chance here. And so that's why we came up with the demolition program, which has gotten a lot of attention lately.
Yeah.
We came up with the ability to buy the side lot for $100. We came up with 0% interest loans so people could start fixing their houses up. And so what they saw is when we came in and started tearing houses down, then people said, well, okay, now I'm feeling a little bit better. Maybe I'll fix my gutters and fix my sidewalk because the neighborhood is starting to look and feel a lot better. And so that was the intent. And then you couple that with, let's improve some city services. Let's fix the lights. Let's pick up the trash on time. Let's take care of the illegal dump sites. Let's get the police response time down. Let's get the EMS response time down. So people start to feel better about where they live. Their quality of life starts to go up. We talked about that when I ran for mayor, and my goodness, back in 2001, we were talking about quality of life and use those terms and what we needed to do. So here we are still talking about doing that, but now it's really starting to happen. And so now people feel better about their neighborhoods and about their community, just simply because that abandoned house across the street's torn down. We've either put somebody new in that school, or we've torn that down, or we've at least boarded it up so that kids don't have to walk by that on the way to their other school that they're going to. And so it's a combination of things, Bob, that really makes people just feel better about where they are. And that's really the key. Now, you do all that, but you still got to keep people employed so you can keep some money flowing around. You've got the same problem in the residential area as you do on the commercial strip, as you get abandoned property there where businesses also left abandoned structures. And so before people, and they're on their way to come see you, they drive down the commercial strip. Well, if they're seeing abandoned buildings there, they're not going to feel very good about turning off of those streets into those neighborhoods. So we adopted the same kind of program on the commercial strips, where if we own the building as the city, we put it on a demolition list if we couldn't refurbish it. If we didn't own it, we had a nuisance abatement program where we literally would, either residential or commercially, sue the private owner, because we can't tear a house down if we don't own it. And so the mayor had a program when he was the prosecutor where it was a nuisance abatement suit that you would file against an owner that basically says that you can't maintain your property so that it's a nuisance to the surrounding properties. And to the extent that you do, we're going to litigate. If you don't bring it back up to code in 120 days, by law, the title goes to the municipality, in this case, the city. So now once we own it, we can now control the disposition of it. If it's something that can be refurbished, we would put it on auction and have somebody refurbish it and bring it up to code. If it couldn't, we'd put it on the demolition list and tear it down. Once you tear it down, now you have an empty lot. We put a side lot program together. It says you have a lot that's next to your house and you want it, you can have it for $100. That was precedent setting. I mean, we would have, Bob, on Saturdays, and we did this all winter and spring, side lot fairs, where we would go into a district and say, show up at such and such a place, we'll be there from 12 to 6, and if you've got a side lot next to you and you can prove you live next door to it, we'll sell you that lot for $100. And so the looks on people's faces, they literally would walk away with the deed in their hand that day. And so we've got all kinds of pictures with the mayor and other folks who, they just couldn't believe it. I mean, they'd been trying to buy that side lot for 15 years. We streamlined the process, put a whole new program in place, and people were literally walking away with the deeds. And so we've done that close to 3,000 times now. And so, again, you're just really starting to rebuild the community and the feeling that people have about their community. And so it spurs them to want to fix up their house, to make sure that other people respect their neighborhood because they feel better about it. And so, again, I think we're heading in the right direction. It's an exciting time to be in Detroit. We got a long way to go. When we came into office, we had 90,000 pieces of property, 40,000 abandoned homes in Detroit, and so we're knocking them down, one at a time. We've done 7,000 since we're here. We still have some more to go, but it's a start, and that gets us there. Yeah.
It's gone. It's gone.
Right.
That's amazing.
Right.
I've driven by that for years. And
that whole area over there. And so, you can go into a lot of neighborhoods now that begin to look different as they're transitioning now on their way back to revitalization. I mean, we've been through the period of abandonment, of people stripping houses and commercial stuff and really hitting rock bottom, and now we're starting to come back up where we're getting all of that out of the way and repurposing the land and the property, and that's really what we're doing.
One thing this project has really shown me is when I start talking about population loss or 67 or Coleman Young, and it's sometimes the reaction I get is, don't confuse me with the facts. I want to believe what I want to believe.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And I don't care if you can show me every statistics. Don't confuse me with the facts. Coleman Young did it. Whatever.
Yep.
In any case, is there? It has nothing to do with my question, but is there? Sometimes it seems like the education or communication or, how can people in the neighborhoods be? What is it that is there things that, in addition to the various programs and mentoring and self-confidence and self-esteem and leadership and all, are there skills, is there information that you think the people in the neighborhoods could benefit from having as part of trying to move the neighborhoods forward? Because as much as I'd like to say, we're going to do this exhibit and this process, and we're going to create 1,000 jobs in each neighborhood. I'd love to tell you that,
right?
But I can't do that,
right? Well, there's no question. I mean, and we talk about Mayor Coleman Young, and I mean, he always said that just a simple job makes a huge difference in somebody's life. Give a man a chance to be able to earn a fair wage for a fair day's work. Yeah, and
it's kind of the same thing.
That's right, and let him take care of his family, and you'll see a drastic change in the community and what goes on. And so we clearly have to tackle this employment situation in Detroit. I mean, if we do all of these improvements and the things that we're doing, but we don't give people the ability to have gainful employment, it's all going to be for naught. And so obviously we have to deal with the education piece, which is another discussion for another time. But the job training and preparing our citizens for the jobs that are available today. So, we talked about social media and high tech and Google and all those things. There's a ton of new jobs that are available there. But we don't have a trained citizenry yet to do that. And so that's what our Detroit Employment Solutions Corporation is doing under Tom Lawan. They're training thousands of people a week, literally, through programs that are geared towards training folks for the jobs that are available rather than just training them for training's sake. That's going to make a huge difference. We're having a lot of success with that now. I think we need to keep it going because what happens in those neighborhoods, they can't buy the auction house if you don't have the money that comes from a job that you were making. We're going to build a new bridge of some type at some point. There's going to be thousands of jobs generated by that. The new Illich Arena, there's thousands of jobs that are going on down there, but they're skilled trades jobs for the most part. And so we've got to make sure that people are trained in those skilled trades areas. And we're doing a fairly decent job of making sure that Detroiters are getting those jobs through the programs that we've put in place. The M1 rail that's running here outside on Woodward, the same thing. And so all of this economic activity is going to happen in Detroit. There's no question about it. The challenge for the leaders is to make sure that with that economic activity that Detroiters, those who live and who have remained in Detroit, are getting those jobs and are an integral part of that economic cycle. We've had ups and downs over that in the last 50 years, or whether we're involved in it or not, but to the extent that your citizenry is not involved, that's when the 1967s happened. Because you got the have-nots starting to see what the haves have, and they resent that. And so that's why you get the stories now of Tale of Two Cities in Detroit. You got the haves, the have-nots, you got downtown versus the neighborhoods. A lot of that is not true, and it's myth, but you have to eliminate the perception. And it's done. If everybody's working and has got a job, they're not going to be doing a lot of complaining. So we'll see the complaints go down when people feel like they're a part of it and they can go out and take care of their family, they have a decent paying job, and they're truly a part of the economic uplift of Detroit. We're getting there. We're not there yet. We've got a lot more to do, but we've got the systems in place now, I think, to make that happen. So I'm encouraged by it. 15 years ago, it wasn't this bright. And we're here now. So you look at 50 years from 1967, and we've come a long way. You and I were talking earlier. You ride up 12th Street now, which is better known as Rosa Parks, and you go to where the insurrection started on 12th and Claremont. It does not even look the same. You can't find. There's no retail stores there. Blind Pig is certainly not there, which is what sparked the whole thing. It's residential housing. And so time and life moves on. And so you can't find where that riot started or that insurrection started. And so we have to do that same thing in Detroit mentally. We have to move on from that. And we can still have the memory. It's not necessarily a good memory, but let's move on. 12th Street looks different now than it did then. It was commercial, retail, all the way up from the boulevard going up to Claremont. And now it's all housing. And then you've got Victoria Park there, which is a very nice middle-class housing complex that's there. People doing well, living well. You've got still the mall that's there. We got the Williams Recreation Center there. So it's a completely different place. And what that says is that you can move beyond where you were 50 years ago. And so if we were still looking at that the way it looked in 1967, we'd be in real trouble here in Detroit. So I'm encouraged that you can't find the location of where that started. And I think that's a good sign for us. And it took us a long time to get there. We lived with the scars of 1967, as you know, for a long time, because the media and other people kept talking about it as a negative. Raid on the Blind Pig on 12th and Claremont, the unemployment, the Big Four. You heard all of the negative things. you'd see all the pictures of the flames and the firefighters and the tanks running down the street and the National Guard. And I think we've finally moved away from that. And so that's why what you're doing with this to commemorate this is good and is exciting, but we got to be very careful to make sure that we show the positive side of it,
Right.
rather than reminding people of the negatives of it, because it took us just way too long to get beyond that. I mean, people blame they called them the riots and the '67 insurrection. People blame that for everything for
Right.
25 years
Right.
before we ever got beyond it. So I think this is going to be very good and positive. You're heading in the right direction.
Yeah. I think the idea is to make it a bookend, make it
Right.
make it a closure.
Right.
You know, not, I don't know if it's a good analogy or not, but not unlike the bankruptcy. It's bookend.
Exactly.
Let's move along.
Good example.
You know, and not to minimize it, because they're both big,
That's right.
gut-wrenching, horrible personal things for a lot of people. It's not like get over it, but let's put a stake in the ground.
Yep. And move
move
forward.
on and move from destruction to rebuilding.
No
Or
question.
Continue the rebuilding. But that's the goal, and how we can do that, you know, through an exhibit is one small way. That's why this project is bigger than that. To how could we do a variety of things in the community with other partners to move that along?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the whole deal. That's why we want to talk to your guys and see how we can facilitate their work in the neighborhoods and
Right.
because that's, as you know, that's a sleeping giant.
Oh, there's no question. And the fabric of any community is the neighborhood.
Yeah,
And
sure.
people like to separate us and say downtown and neighborhoods, but you know, downtown and midtown are neighborhoods too,
Right.
and I consider them neighborhoods. And they're a vital part of the fabric and the operation of a city.
Right.
And history shows us that cities start in a central downtown area and expand from there. And so it makes sense that as you revitalize a city, you start there and go out again. It's not the natural course of things to start out this way and go down central. And so downtown and midtown now have gotten a good start and they're off and running. And now you see it beginning to expand out into the neighborhoods. And so it goes west out into Corktown and down in
Yeah.
the southwest, and we go east to East Jefferson and the East Riverfront. We come up north through the M1 and through the New Center area and through the North End, and we're going out northwest Livernois 7 Mile, going further east on East Warren. So it is starting to spread. It's not as glamorous as downtown and midtown, so
Right.
people in the press don't pay as much attention to it,
Right.
but we have some very exciting developments going on out in the community. In Recovery Park on the east side, the mayor was just doing a press
Yes.
conference out there.
So I'm playing tennis on Chandler Park.
And we were just playing tennis, he and I, out at Chandler Park, which is East Warren and
Yeah.
Connor. Livernois 7 Mile was a focus for us. Livernois 6 Mile, the Eds and Meds corridor, Baker's Keyboard Lounge. You know, Detroit's 140 square miles, and it's changing. It's being revitalized everywhere, and the investors, when they come to town, are not just looking at downtown. We have some serious investors that are looking at doing some things on the East Riverfront and in Corktown, and on the far east side, the northeast side, around the airport. So
Yeah, great.
we do this thing in another 10 years, and we won't recognize Detroit.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and I credit you for a lot of, you've been through a lot.
No question.
And for you to sit here and say it with such enthusiasm and sincerity, and I know it comes from your heart, is great.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So,
Good being a Detroiter.
yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I can't imagine being anywhere else. Our daughter is I digress.
Right.
She's graduating this year from Michigan, and
Go Blue.
and she is, you know, fortunate that she's smart, and she's going to the Ross Business School.
Oh, good.
And so she's got an offer that from Deloitte here in town, which she's very excited about. And now but they're taunting her to come to Chicago for some interviews this weekend.
That's right.
So, but I think she's going to decide. And she did, the U of M has a program called Semester in Detroit. She did last year, it's the summer. And all of a sudden, I was like, Dad, don't embarrass me too, like the rock star, because her dad knew all about Detroit history, you know. And she did too, because we would drag her around since she was
Yep.
8 years old down
Yep,
there.
absolutely, absolutely.
And so the attitude is so different.
Yeah.
of that 21-year-old.
Yeah, well, we can compete now with
Yeah.
those other places in terms of things that millennials and recent grads like to do, want to do, and they like exciting things,
Like Demondos.
places to go. Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. I walked by there the other day. I couldn't believe it. And I've known Larry for years. Like, man, he really figured this out
Yeah.
and provides what is
Yeah.
these millennials like and what they need. And so, years ago we couldn't compete with the Chicagos and the New Yorks and the Atlantas. And certainly the West Coast, but we've got the same kinds of things we can offer now. On top of it being home, where they can come back and be closer to mom and dad and brothers and sisters, etc. So
And make a big mark easier.
absolutely, absolutely.
These millennials you've got all over your place there, if they go or if they stay, that's quite a turnaround to be part of. To be part of that team, I think is, and I know they work hard.
Oh yeah,
They work
they
a lot.
do. That's right. There's no
Whenever I see them, they
question.
complain about it.
That's right.
But they go back for more the next day.
Exactly. They
So,
keep coming back every day, and
in
it's
the
great.
most complimentary way.
Yep.
And I won't drop any names, but come to know a lot of those guys. But,
Right.
They've been helpful, and enthusiasm, and a lot of the people that, like Alicia and Brad and folks like that stuck through some
Rough times. Yeah,
Tough times, man.
We started those budget cuts, man, in the mid 2000s. Those were tough times. I still have the scars from when I was the recreation director, and we had to close 17 recreation centers.
Yeah.
And that's again fabric in the neighborhoods. I mean,
Sure.
people have stories of, my dad grew up in that rec center. I grew up in that rec center. That kept me out of trouble going to that rec center, and I had to come and close it. And some of the more famous ones, I mean, Kronk, Brewster. Evans on the east side. I mean, those were tough, but the city just didn't have the money or the resources to keep them going. And so now we're bringing a lot of those back. We're building a new Kemeny down in Southwest. We built a new Heilman out in Northeast. We've got some great partnerships and things that we're doing with Mitch Album and his group over at Lipke. The Chandler Park Conservancy, doing Chandler Park, where we were the other day. And so a lot of it's beginning to come back, and so I'm fortunate to have been maybe a part of the demise, but also now being part of the rebirth, which is really great. And that's why I know that we're on the right track. It's coming back.
Yeah. I remember the discussion of putting the cement bunkers in front of Fort Wayne. Just see what happens.
That's right.
Just see what happens.
That's exactly right.
You just
We're even going to refurbish that one day, believe it or not. It's a tough one. It's a tough one, but we'll get there.
That's a big one, but
Yep.
it's all good. Anything else? I don't want to keep you here much longer. I
This
think
is
your
great.
reflections have been good, and,
Yeah.
and thank you. They were personal and encouraging too. That it is, and you can be assured that we are doing it the right way. It's not going to be about smoke and fires and how many people died. We need to acknowledge that,
Right.
because that's part of history.
It's part of the history.
You can't hide from
Yep.
it. You can't sugarcoat it, or you can't minimize it. It would
That's
be
right.
insulting to minimize it.
No question.
But the focus is on where we go from here, and that's why.
Yeah.
That's why it's such an exciting
No,
project.
thank you for doing this, and thank you for asking me to be a part of it.
Yeah,
This has
well-
been absolutely great, man. I could talk about this stuff
Oh, I
forever.
know. Yeah, or any topic for that matter.